Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Musical Innertube. I'm Don Rooney.
And I'm John Timpane. You know, Don's had quite a career in radio and television, where he's been an air personality, a news anchor, even a TV weatherman.
And John's been a college professor. He's written several books, and he's been an editor and features writer at the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper.
We first teamed up for a radio show in college. On one show, we introduced a soothing musical interlude.
But we stumbled, and it came out Musical Innertube.
And that became the name for this here podcast, where we talk with interesting people about their interesting lives. Difference makers who really make a difference.
On today's episode of the Musical Innertube, our topic is the art and life of Edward Hopper, his studies of New England houses and light, and his scenes of New York life, such as Nighthawk of 1942, the one with the corner coffee shop with just a few people inside, you've seen it, are among the most recognizable cultural products of the 20th century. They're quoted, reframed, and even satirized all over the place, from the movies of Alfred Hitchcock to The Simpsons. Our guest today is BAFTA award-winning filmmaker Phil Grabsky, whose marvelous new documentary, Hopper, An American Love Story, is timed to coincide with a major exhibition, Edward Hopper's New York, showing now through March 2023 at the Whitney Museum in New York. We're really glad to welcome you, Phil Grabsky.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure for me.
Ours too. Here's a softball just to start things off. Can you explain your subtitle for us? We get Edward Hopper, but why An American Love Story?
When I started working on this film, which was about 4 years ago, and I should say it fits into our cinema brand, Exhibition on Screen,
right?
Which and this is our 10th anniversary, 10 years. So we have films in production all the time and distribution. I mean, this is actually our 33rd feature film we've made over 10 years.
That's incredible. I can't believe
it is incredible, and you can see why I'm tired. But half the time it's just because I or one of my colleagues has an interest in a particular artist. And 4 years ago, it was about 4 years ago, I realized that actually I wanted to make a film about Edward Hopper. Many of his paintings, particularly the ones based in New York, are well known. I knew his name, but I realized that many people didn't even know his name. And in fact, during the course of the production, I've been rather surprised how often people would say, "Oh, I don't even know who that is." And as always with Exhibition on Screen, the intention is to find out more about the artist behind the artworks, and by doing so, learn more about the artworks. Now, when I started to research him and some preliminary reading, some preliminary conversations, my initial thought for a title, and a title's very important to draw people into the cinema, to make people aware that this is, a cinematic experience. It's not going to be a lecture. It's not going to be a walk through a museum or a gallery show. My initial thought was to call it Edward Hopper, Light and Shade. And again, there's an ambivalence to that title. One is that clearly as an artist, he's working with light and shade. And for him, light is absolutely everything. He's just fascinated, passionate about the depiction of light.
Yes.
But it has a secondary parallel meaning, which refers to his character. And certainly lots of people will talk about his melancholic side, his even misogynistic side, miserable side. Actually, I started to find out relatively quickly that was a little unfair, and he's actually more complex than that. As the pictures themselves depict, there is humor and there is love in what he does too. But as I progressed and journeyed to Nyack, where he was born, and started speaking to the experts, and then really spent some time in New York and then on the Cape in New England, basically I realized that to understand Edward Hopper, you have to understand his wife, Joan Iverson. And she has been overlooked by a sexist art historical world. And actually, you simply you can't understand his paintings without understanding her. And indeed, she is his model throughout his life. She's in so many of the paintings. And I realized that actually though it's volatile and it's complex, and there are times when his behavior is almost abusive, and just even the silent treatment is a form of abuse, isn't it? If you don't talk to someone for days and days. But also there's love there too, which I think is sometimes missed. Plus, again, parallel to that is what Hopper is doing, and it's such an interesting moment in American art history, is he's saying, I don't need to go to Europe. I don't need to be in Rome painting the Colosseum, or in Paris. I've done Paris. It's my one foreign trip. Actually, I'm really happy just painting what's local to me, which 6 months is New York and 6 months is New England. That's enough. And it's at a time when America is kind of constructing its own self-identity. And Hopper is part of that. So he's saying, look at the everyday. Actually, don't just walk past buildings. Don't just walk past shop windows. Don't just walk past, actually have a closer look. And there's remarkable detail in there. And so that echoes in a way what Exhibition on Screen is all about, which is stop, take a bit of time to look. He has it's not to say he loves everything about America, but there's a love on his part for many elements of a American life. So it has that parallel meaning. And all of that is done in partly to encourage people into the cinema. And ultimately An American Love Story is a slightly more appealing title perhaps than Hopper, Light and Shade, which perhaps sounds a bit more like an exhibition.
Well, we do learn, don't we, that Joe and Ed hop in the car and take cross-country drives, and that they had a ball, that they pull over to the side and sketch in the car. And it was just a chance to renew and see things they hadn't done before. And you can see both, if you will, both love stories being enacted. The love story of Joe's words about the kind of Americans that they met and the kind of America that they saw. I mean, you see that love story too. Well,
there is a great script to be written based on her diaries of those trips. And, it's the kind of thing that we've seen in films before. Obviously the journey is such a wonderful narrative for a film. Pretty much they are locked into 6 months New York, 6 months New England, but occasionally they go on these trips. And, they're one luxury, really, because they lived a very Spartan life. Their kitchen is basically a wood burner.
She didn't like to play. She didn't like to cook. And,
and nor did he.
No, and he expected to be waited on.
Yeah. I was nervous at the beginning that, people say, well, Joe Hopper, he never spoke. He didn't give interviews. He would never in a million years have done anything like this. All we found, bear in mind, he is one of the most popular American artists in the middle of the 20th century. I found 2 filmed interviews with him. And, we looked, any newspaper article that he wrote or periodical or radio interview, we got them all and we transcribed really very little. He just didn't want to do it, various reasons. So you worry as a filmmaker, well, where's my insight? What we found with Hopper, which was so great, is that not only was she a chatterbox and never stopped talking, but she also never stopped writing. And she kept these diaries, which have not really been terribly well publicized. They've never been published. But we were able to make use of them, and they are extremely revealing. Now, of course, they're giving her perspective, but both their characters come through. And it's, the 2 of them in the car together for all those thousands of miles must have been a strain. But you always judge people by their actions as much as by how you perceive them from the outside. Despite everything, for pretty much 40 years, every day they woke up in the same bed. Right. And in a funny kind of way, I think that says something about the resilience. And actually, there's definitely an interdependence there, but I think there's also love there. And why all this is important is because these paintings, you mentioned Nighthawks. Ultimately, we chose Nighthawks as our poster image because it is his most famous painting. It's much parodied. In fact, I saw one only 2 days ago a kind of Halloween parody of it. But who was the artist? What is he? What actually is he trying to say? Why are there no signs on the windows? Why is there no handle on the door? Who are these people, etc., etc.? Well, the more you understand who he was and who his wife was, the more you get clues, and actually, the more powerful, the more interesting, and the more you understand the multiple narratives going on in that painting. And there's plenty of others like that, of course.
To focus on Joe for a second, the film does make it clear, as you said earlier, that she was a chatterbox. I think at one point there was a neighbor who said we couldn't get her to shut up whenever she came over to visit. And she had a not a successful art career, but she had a burgeoning art career when she met Edward Hopper, which she then gave up in order to support him. And at one point that sounds very sacrificial, but on the other point, there's a point in the film where you get the idea that maybe she thinks his genius is worth giving up whatever she had in order to further his genius. Is that kind of where you wound up?
Yeah. So she's definitely they both in the same art school. She was a little bit younger than him, but she was there at the same time. Interestingly, he's 6 years at this art school, which is a very long time, really. But as we show with the job that he gets while he's still at art school and when he leaves art school is as an illustrator. And he is magnificent. Post-American Civil War, you have this economic explosion, and part of that is railroads. But one of the other aspects of the railway was that it encouraged the distribution of magazines. Really interesting. Now, as an aside, one of the things that happens is that gardening magazines become really popular for women. These things have to be illustrated, these magazines, so you have the growth of illustrations, and also in tandem with that, and this would make a good film too, obviously comics. Oh, yeah. Again, fantastic artists. Mm-hmm. So Edward Hopper, to drag it back to your question, Edward Hopper becomes one of these illustrators, and I include a number of these illustrations to show he's a very, very good artist.
They're quite beautiful. Yeah.
Beautiful. And also we then show some of his etchings, which is a very complicated thing to do an etching. He's absolutely a master of it, to show that, as with all these great artists, when they end up with a particular style, it's a choice. It's not that they can only paint like that. Sorry, to answer your question, they're at this art school together. She is a little bit younger than him, but they don't really meet again properly till 1923. There were, again, because of this development of art history in the United States, you have what's known as communes, where artists would come together in the summer and they would paint. How wonderful. I mean, fantastic. Gloucester, which at one time, I believe, was the United States' third most important port, but it was somewhere that artists would congregate. Again, historical context is everything. New York was absolutely packed. And bear this in mind when you look at a Hopper painting. It's so unrealistic in some ways because there were millions of people coming. My own grandparents came from Poland. People not only recently enfranchised slaves, but people were coming up from the south. New York was absolutely rammed. The streets were so crammed, and it gets very hot. New York gets very hot in the summer with a lack of air conditioning and a lack of refrigeration and all the rest of it. Those that could moved out. So these artists would go to Gloucester. Edward Hopper was amongst them, and he meets Joe Nivison. And they just strike it off. And as the film says, there's a particular moment. It might be a bit of one of those slightly romantic ideas, but he started reciting a poem to her in French, and he paused, and she carried on in French. And he thought, there's an interesting young woman. She taught him watercolors. Again, the film talks about this, and her palette was brighter than his. But the key moment is that she had been invited to exhibit some artworks at a show in Brooklyn Museum of Art. He'd only sold one painting, one oil painting in 10 years, but she got him an invite to show some of his watercolors, and they sold, and his career took off. And yes, to go back to your question, she makes a decision that she's going to support him, even though that affects her own career. Now, there's a couple of things there. One, if you are, as he was, totally 100% passionate about what you're doing, you wouldn't make that decision. So it actually demonstrates that she wasn't 100% committed to being an artist. Two, I think she saw that he was a better artist than her. Now, very difficult for us to say that when, those two watercolors that we have in the film side by side of the same scene, I don't think you can necessarily say which one's better. But she saw something in him that she wanted to support. Also, being a woman, she was probably that was going to be a prohibiting factor. But right at the end of the film, what I would ask people to pay attention to is in one of those small clips that we found this wonderful clip of her. She's actually, basically she's surrounded by her paintings. They're all in black and white, unfortunately. And most of these paintings have disappeared. They were left to the Whitney, as I've been told. The Whitney didn't treat them with the same respect as they treated Edward Hopper's artworks, as I've been told. And so they were kind of sent out to schools and hospitals to put on their walls where they also, but if you just freeze frame that moment, you won't be able to do it in the cinema, but subsequently, if you watch the film through our website, there's some really interesting paintings there. And it's such a shame they've disappeared, because she kind of comes back to painting later in her life. He is something special, and it would be impossible for me to know whether she could have been as special as him, particularly in a male-dominated art world. But yes, she absolutely decides to be his manager. She negotiates. She keeps people away from the interviews. She helps him find the location. She helps him buy his brushes and his paints. And this is a man who loves to be in his own bubble, but so at times he keeps her out of the bubble, but he's totally reliant on her as well.
We'll return to our podcast in just a moment, but right now, here's a soothing musical interlude.
Phil Grabsky is a very accomplished filmmaker, TV producer, author, and educator in the United Kingdom. Since 1984, his production company, Seventh Art Productions, has worked with major British and international broadcasters and shown films in nearly 100 countries, specializing in documentaries on art, history, social issues, and classical music.
He's also produced the In Search Of series, which you may have seen on PBS, tracing the lives and art of composers such as Beethoven and Mozart. He's worked with Terry Jones of Monty Python to produce the Secret History Of series, and he has had major international success with feature films such as Muhammad Ali, Through the Eyes of the World, and My Childhood, My Country, 20 Years in Afghanistan, which won this year's Best Single Documentary Award at the BAFTAs.
Since 2012, Phil has been producing the Exhibition on Screen series, full-length films based on a particular current major museum exhibit, exploring the life and art of a major artist.
His blog is at philgrabsky.blogspot.com. Check out both the Exhibition on Screen webpage at exhibitiononscreen, all one word, .com, and the Seventh Art webpage at seventh-art.com, which features downloads of his films.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube.
One other thing that we see in the movie, which I very much recommend people see, and by the way, I'm going to go see this in a big theater because I want to have the experience of seeing something like New York Movie, on the big screen, sort of lovingly panned over. I would like to find it in a local movie theater, and I think there's no substitute for that. I mean, Don and I have seen it on the screens of our computers because that's how this operation works. But one of the things you're trying to do is give people the pleasure of seeing these in a huge format to sort of see the pleasure just of absorbing the colors and what the artist does, which I like. And one of the things in the film that I very much appreciate is that you present this discussion about what's happening in the paintings because, well, ... no one knows. They are enigmatic. Many people have gotten a sense of desertion and abandonment, depopulation, isolation, loneliness. You hear this all the time from people who look at the paintings and say this, but you very carefully make sure that you get people on the other side, including Hopper himself, who says, well, those are critics talking. I don't really care. There's one critic lady who says, I don't find that at all. I don't find isolation at all. It is so hard to come at so many of his paintings without remarking at least that there's a mystery to them that we don't know. Well, is the usherette who's, sort of leaning against the side wall of the movie theater, is she happy to be there? What's happening with her? Why are there no doors in or out of the diner in the Night Hawk? That's such a strange motion. And how come it's very rare, except in maybe paintings like Chop Suey, it's very rare to see people actually interacting or talking to each other. So there's all this, you see moments in a story, but you don't know what the story is, what preceded, what succeeded. You don't know what brought them there. I mean, it seems like a narrative art that doesn't let you in. I
think it's cinema is key to this. First of all, let me just say something about exhibition on screen. So we release 4 films a year, 2 cinemas, and in fact this year it's going to be 5 because we're doing we've added in this big Vermeer exhibition that's happening in Amsterdam next February. But we sit in this genre known as event cinema. So with the Met Opera, with NT Live, National Theatre, with the Royal Opera House. There's a plus and a minus to that. The advantage is that event cinema is popular worldwide now, and we can get a documentary about Edward Hopper, but even more, perhaps put him to one side, but in a previous film, say about Edvard Munch or about Bosch or even about Mary Cassatt. But we can get them into 50, 60 countries, 1,000, 1,500 cinemas, in the same way as you just, a standard release of an opera, you wouldn't get operas in the cinema. The downside is that they play 2 times, 3 times. They're brief moments in the cinema. So you have to be alert. I would obviously encourage people to sign up to our newsletter at seventh-art.com to know when the next film is coming to a cinema, hopefully relatively near your audience. We do try, subsequent to the cinemas, we do definitely try, and we do screen in art galleries. Again, your wonderful galleries. Many of them have fantastic auditoriums, and they're almost actually our most successful screenings in Houston or Boston or Washington or Honolulu. Still waiting for my invite there. But because there's no question that one of the appeals of what we do, and the reason I started Exhibition on Screen, was the opportunity to look at the art on the big screen. We are so fortunate. Now, there's negative sides to it, of course, but we're so fortunate with the way technology has gone in the last 10, 15 years. Technology for the cinema, I don't think it needs to get any better. I just come back from the United States. I saw this film on the big screen in a number of cinemas, and in some of them, it looks exactly the same quality as in the post-production suite, but across a big screen. And I have curators and art historians and people in the film who come and watch the film, and they go, I've never seen the works of Rembrandt, Leonardo, Michelangelo look like this. It's amazing. So that obviously better to see them in the cinema. And it's very interesting that cinema is so influential on him. And there's that wonderful moment in the film where, he's clearly influenced by cinema, and then it starts to shift that he's influencing the filmmakers like Hitchcock.
I just want to mention that there's that luscious still that you run where we see the What's the
House on the
hotel?
Hill.
Bates Hotel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Hitchcock's Psycho, which really does seem like it might have been taken out of a Hopper.
He told his set builder, he said, copy the painting. They just copied the painting.
That's so great.
Hopper loved that.
And he was a big fan of noir, I think, wasn't he? Film noir, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think he loved those.
In the exhibition in the Whitney, which is a fabulous exhibition. Again, very fortunately, there was this guy who, Reverend Sanborn, who he held on to a lot of this archival material, which otherwise would have been thrown away. And he's come in for a bit of criticism because people are saying, "Well, how did he get all this stuff? Who left?" But actually, he was part of Joe's will. It's a very complicated will. It's like stuff was left in 6 different people, and I don't know. There was a bank that decided who got what, and anyway. But irrespective, we should be very grateful to him because he held on to stuff like cinema ticket stubs, and there's a fantastic cabinet in this exhibition, and all credit to the curator, Kim. Beautiful white cabinet, and it's just the multicolored, all these cinema stubs are different colors, all torn in half, and they've written on every single one of them what the name of the film was. They went to the cinema all the time. I mean, he only did maybe 2-3 paintings a year, but the rest of the time he's just thinking about it. It's his whole life. He's thinking about it. He's going to the cinema. He's been engaged with storytelling. And that's the key. The key to these paintings is to understand that he is a master storyteller. And for me, they're almost like still frames. So broadly speaking, cinema works on the basis of, 24 or 25 frames a second. Hopper, sometimes you look at his paintings and you're not quite sure what's happened before. You're not quite sure what's happened afterwards. And I think he's so thoughtful. I think he's deliberately saying, well, you have to decide, are this couple getting on? Or this couple not getting on? It's a split second. Is she depressed, or is she just looking out the window? He's playing with you. Now, he's not sour. Just because he didn't want to give interviews didn't mean that he was sour. When he speaks, he's actually very articulate and quite funny. And I think that humor, he's enjoying playing with you. He's enjoying making you laugh. He's enjoying making you think, how do they get into that dining? There's no door. There's no signs. The curator points out that the one door inside has no handle on it. And everybody goes, oh, yeah, but it's the door that goes into the kitchen. Yeah, but if you look carefully, the guy behind the counter completely surrounds him. That's not the kitchen door, because he'd have to leapfrog over the bar or go right to the back, come all the way around, go through that door. He's doing it deliberately. He's playing with you. And all the little jokes, X-Lax as a title, Philly's cigars. I mean, I think he's actually quietly quite funny and quite humorous. And what you get from learning more about him, what you get from learning more about her, is how these narratives are playing out. And some of it he's offering you the narrative, and some of it he's saying, well, you have to think to yourself. And again, it all comes back to just take a little bit longer to look. It's so easy to look and move on. The reason that these great artists remain great, and it goes right back to Bosch and Leonardo, is because they are conveying human emotions that don't really change, and human stories that don't really change, despite everything, all the stuff that's around us, all the books and the DVDs and the technology. We as humans are probably, it's good for us to remember that 1,000 years ago, men and women probably thought and acted pretty much the same. And I think Hopper gets that. And so these paintings are not just about loneliness. It's kind of too lazy to assume that. Sometimes he's celebrating solitude. Sometimes he's saying it's about the space between people. Sometimes it's just about, even in a crowd, yes, you can be lonely, or sometimes in a crowd you can be deliberately in your own bubble. And the narratives vary from painting to painting. And it's also a celebration of that sense of, well, take a closer look. Complex, yes, not always very pleasant, tough to be friends with, sometimes abusive to his wife, inexcusable. Although I think she gave as good as she got. But a master artist, yeah, absolutely.
Let's finish this off with a little bit about you, Phil. You've done a lot of documentaries, mostly on music and art, but also on other topics. A little bit about how you got into that, and a little bit about why your company is called Seventh Arts. Where did you get that name?
Just on that last thing, sometimes I get people coming to me wanting to work as researchers. I always say the same thing. I say, okay, go away and come back to me with a definition of why we're called Seventh Art and what are the seven arts. They never reappear.
I particularly just failed that myself.
They never come back. So everyone, people have their influences and influential people in their backgrounds. For me, it was my sister's husband, who was a very good amateur photographer. And to cut a long story short, by the time I finished school at 18, I wanted to be a photographer too. And I did apply for and managed to get into photography college in London. They had like 1,000 applicants and they took 42 people. So it was a tough thing to get into. But I had my portfolio. But I decided to have a year break from school. So, the gap year, which I don't know how common it is in the States. It's very common over here in Britain. And I went to visit my brother. And again, just people are in your orbit are so influential. My brother was in India traveling. And I thought, it'd be great to go traveling with him. But when I turned up at Delhi airport, he said, I've only got 2 weeks left. My visa's about to run out. So we'll just go to one place. Going to a place called McLeod Ganj in the Himalayan foothills. Didn't mean anything to me. Had this amazing bus journey up and got to a place called McLeod Ganj. And in fact, more specifically, a place called Dharamsala, where I very soon learned this was the base of the Dalai Lama of Tibet and the Tibetans in exile. I have to be honest, I'd never heard of the Dalai Lama of Tibet. And, but I very soon learnt, and I was absolutely fascinated by it. And, I couldn't learn enough about them. And one of the impacts of that was I thought I'd like to do something about these Tibetans, but I need sound, I swapped from wanting to be a photographer to wanting to be a filmmaker in that short trip. As an aside, I went back to make this film and got to meet and interview the Dalai Lama, and I had to sign the visitor's book. And you went through the visitor's book and it was all very, very small writing from all these Buddhist monks and professors of Buddhism and people studying Buddhism, all very little. And the last person to sign before me, this is absolutely the truth, had done a huge kind of signature. And his girlfriend had done a big smiley face that took up the whole page. Richard Gere and his girlfriend. So Hollywood. It was so Hollywood. They'd taken up basically 2 pages just for themselves. Everyone else was like 30 names per page. Anyway, I came back to England and I made a film while I was at college about the Dalai Lama of Tibet. A biography. Started at the beginning and ended at him living in Dharamsala. It was called the Dalai Lama of Tibet, 25 years in exile. It's probably now something like 65 years in exile. So I sold my Dalai Lama film to ITV. I was asked to make another film and I had to set up a production company to sign the contract. Now, 7 has always been my lucky number. My girlfriend at the time was French. So in Paris, you'd see reference to this thing called Le Septième Art, sorry. The seventh art. And I just kind of quite like the name, but I basically, in short, back in kind of Roman times, there were 7 arts, but they tended to be kind of more geometry and astrology. And there came a point in the Middle Ages where it split off and you got 7 creative arts. And so drama and ballet and music. And certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, the 7th was film.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it was before. Maybe there were only 6 before. Maybe they added the 7th. But in France, and in fact in Europe generally, film is always referred to as the 7th art. And it's amazing. See, the fact you asked the question is very good, because it's amazing how many times people don't ask, what's the 7th art? What are the other 6? There are probably easier names to have had for the company over the last 40 years, but, we're stuck with it now.
In some ways, you're saying that you're as inscrutable as Hopper is.
Yeah.
I'm giving you some of the answer.
Yeah.
The rest of it you can make up for yourself. But sometimes if you go somewhere like the Escorial just outside Madrid, and you'll be in the library there, which is this is where Philip II lived, the most extraordinary library. But on the ceiling there are the 7 arts. So you'll bump into the 7 arts from time to time. I think the point I was trying to make, though, was that film, even as what was I then, 19, 20, 21, I felt that filmmaking should be an art. And in some ways, it's gone a little bit backwards in some forms, and certainly in terms of British broadcasting. Too often, I mean, I recently sat on a jury of a documentary film festival, and the stories were all very moving and important, but there wasn't a great deal of artistry about them in the way that they were shot, or the music score, or we have to have aspirations when we make our films to make them artistic. With Hopper, I set out to film in a way that was sympathetic and influenced by the way that he painted. The music score that I commissioned, I thought very hard about that and worked very hard with the composer.
Simon Farmer. Yeah.
Simon Farmer. I mean, he did most of the work, of course, but...
By the way, it's absolutely gorgeous. The music is really one of the reasons to go see this film, without a doubt.
It's a beautiful score. And in fact, we're going to put all the scores from Exhibition on the screen. We're just in the process now of making sure they're all available through the website or just on Spotify and all the other platforms. But one of the things I did with this, fine, and I'm taking a bit of time now, but when I sat down with the editor, who I always work with, a guy called Clive Mattock, I said, we're going to start this slightly differently. Normally, even though I'm making visual films, for me, the script is everything. Every comma, every pause, every word is so important, even if you're looking at paintings or sculptures. And sometimes we'll start by laying down the script. But I said to Clive, we're not going to do that on this one. This is different. What we're going to do here is there are 5 key locations, and I've shot them in such a way that we can build them up. I want you to build the locations first with the first ideas of the music soundtrack with no words. So Nyack, where he's born, New York, of course, different periods, but New York, Paris, important, Gloucester, very important moment where, as we've mentioned, he meets Joe Nivison. And also, it's just part of his character. And actually something I identify with. When everyone else is pointing their cameras to the sea and painting boats and waves, he looks the other way. And the 5th location, of course, is Cape Cod.
Yeah, Truro.
Truro. And so we built these locations. And I think that's kind of stayed in the film. Obviously now they're kind of interwoven with text. But it's trying to keep, it's difficult getting people into the cinema, and it's difficult to, I recently went to a presentation by Paramount of their forthcoming films. I was at a convention, and they kind of showed clips from Transformers this and Mission Impossible 56, and basically it was CGI, and it was car chases and a lot of violence. And even though sometimes they tried to make it funny, it's still a lot of violence. And at the end of it, the guy giving the presentation said to the audience, which was industry professionals, and I was in there, he said, "You see, there's something for everyone." And I swear I had to stop myself from getting up and saying, well, there's nothing there for me. I mean, I saw. I mean, but those are the kind of films that make an enormous amount of money, because that's what people think. I don't know. I don't know. I don't, for whatever reason. So we fight our little corner with our art and our history and our music films. But if we don't, who will?
Well, Phil, you've been so generous with us this afternoon. Phil Grabsky, ladies and gentlemen, we've been talking to him about his latest movie. Go see it in a movie theater. You'll be glad you did it. It's Hopper, An American Love Story. You can find out more about Phil and the stuff that he's doing, and there's a lot of it. Exhibition on Screen, for example, his series about art exhibitions, that has its own website. You can look it up and see what's up there. And you can also, Seven Arts has its own website, and there's even a shop, and you can download some of his best films right there. And believe me, you'll certainly see what he's been able to achieve in only 34 short years, and that's pretty crazy. So thank you so much, and thank you for doing what you have done for the arts. Phil Grabsky, thanks again.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Check out our website at musicalinnertube.com, where you'll find all our episodes, profiles of our guests, and lots of extras. You'll even be able to leave us a voicemail.
Our email address is musicalinnertube@gmail.com. On Twitter, our handle is minnertube. Capitalize the M and I.
The Innertube is available on Facebook, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Audible, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, and iHeartRadio podcasts. Like us and give us a good review on any of those platforms.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.